Welcome to Neighbor to Neighbor. My name is Lynn Corum. I'm your host today. And today my guest is Milton Eaton. Milt, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We've had you here before, so we won't make you tell all about yourself, which we make everybody else do. But you and I wanted to talk about, in this program, the economy.
Yes.
And it seems to be the hot button topic right now. And I'd like to start out by saying, Jesus said the poor are always with us. We've had the war on poverty for 60 plus years now. We still haven't solved the problem. So basically, how do we get about making the economy move so we don't have any poor? Is that ever possible? That's the first question.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and part of the reason it's very interesting is that how you define poverty,
right,
to start with, is a very interesting thing. The United Nations says anyone who makes less than $2 a day is in poverty.
Because it's a world standard.
It's world standard. That's real abject poverty. You take a country like Bangladesh, where 80% of the people are in poverty. When you look at the figures, they don't really make $2 a day. They make less than 70 cents a day. So all of the numbers are different outside the United States. But let's talk about the United States.
Okay.
The United States also has poverty as a moving target. The goalposts keep being moved. And unlike, I think, almost any other country, we have people that go into poverty and come out of poverty, so that it is not a group that is locked in like serfs or slaves. The people, by work and attention, can get themselves out of poverty. Because I knew you were going to ask me something about this, I did some homework.
Okay.
And was dumbfounded to find that in the year 2000, the people listed as under poverty situation was at a 26-year high in the year 2000 with 11.3%, and that it dropped to 5.7% by 2004.
Wow, that's huge to have your number like that.
It's not something we heard much about from the media.
No.
That things were improving in that way.
But all we heard was the economy was in horrible shape.
Yes.
But
now, I think it's fair to say the progressives and the liberals never think enough is being done for people in poverty. And how it is counted is very unusual. Now, back when these figures first began to be constructed, they determined that a family that spent more than 1/3 of their total disposable income on food was in poverty.
okay.
And they worked out a basket of basic food, and that proceeded from there. And then they added in measures up to families of 10 or more. But it is hard for me to equate poverty with real poverty when some of the things that we have here we have people that are able to buy houses. For example, 91% of those in the lowest 10% households, definitely officially poor, own color TVs. 74% own microwaves.
So now you're talking about this is the lowest 10% of our population.
Yes.
Income-wise.
Income-wise.
Least amount of money.
Yes. Wealth, they skittle around that. If someone's income is low enough, they can have quite a bit of wealth and still qualify as being poor.
Right.
But dishwashers, computers, all of that is listed. But the fact that many of them own homes and more than 2 cars is all makes me feel that perhaps we're going
reevaluating how we measure.
We keep changing how we measure.
Yeah, because I know that one person from Africa was in town once, I think it was in the paper, and he said, all Americans are rich because all Americans have shoes. But it sounds like, and I know, that almost every apartment, no matter where it is in town, has a cable hookup.
Yes. It just is a question of how much should those who produce transfer to those who do not produce in a system where if you do produce, you can work your way out of this poverty situation. Of all the developed countries, industrialized countries, we have more people at some time in their life might be considered in poverty, but they get out of poverty. And it's not a constant percentage of the people. It is a moving
Group.
So
you're saying that in the United States, it's easier we have a higher percentage of people who either go into poverty but get out of poverty than any other country.
Any other industrial country, yes.
So it's sort of like there are no barriers if you want to work or get skills to have a better paying job and so forth.
Yes.
And you've worked with, I think you've worked with SCORE?
I have worked with SCORE.
Which is a volunteer business tutoring kind of thing.
It is a organization under the Small Business Administration. And SCORE volunteers, because of their business background, go and talk to people who want to try to start a business or to make a business successful.
Right.
It is free advice.
But we have those kinds of services for people who want to maybe be their own boss. We have reasonable loans for small businesses to get started. So there's a big network of encouraging people to better themselves or to be able to make more money.
Absolutely. And the state also has their business development and commercial people. We help, in this state, we help farmers in the same way. Yeah. With loans and some guidance. But SCORE was a very interesting experience for me because of all my business career, it was the only time I have been involved in voluntarily for free giving advice. And advice that is free is like benefits that are free. They aren't necessarily the best or utilized because you haven't paid anything to get it.
So you might not value it as much.
So you may not value it as much.
Interesting.
But it's very interesting. Many people have the idea they'd like to have a business. When you get down to it, many of those people have not yet thought about how they have to plan, how they have to save, how they have to find money to carry through with that plan. So SCORE performs a very good service because it convinces some people that maybe they shouldn't do it, while at the same time helping other people to succeed.
Yeah, I've heard it's a good organization.
Yeah.
Now back on this poverty, rich or poor, it's often a political football to grouse that the income disparity is growing. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, percentage-wise, and it's it basically is class warfare politics.
Yes.
Can you speak about that for a little bit?
As our country's economy has changed and become richer, we have gotten further and further away from the jobs that you do not need an education to be able to do. I may say unfairly that people are unemployable if they are illiterate, because with liability in today's America, I need someone working for me that can at least read the safety instructions on the piece of equipment he is being asked to operate. So the people that are well trained due to equipment, their intelligence, they are able to produce more. People pay you more if you produce more. If you are unable to produce in that arena, you have to compete with everyone else for the lowest of the service jobs. And therefore, there's more competition at that level. At the same time, as we have opened up the world's trade, the less you are trained, the more you have to compete with people from all other countries. Politicians like to talk about China, but it's all other countries, that they can do that same job that you can do in the untrained levels.
And so therefore those are the jobs that we typically see get shipped overseas, as it's said.
It's very often it's a combination, because if the job, very often if they ship a part of the job overseas, it will help keep some of the job here. If they refuse to ship any of the job overseas, it may well mean that earlier in the cycle of that business will go out of business completely and will all be overseas. Mm-hmm. This is why you have the assembly plants in Mexico right along our border, where things can come in and out of the country doing different parts of the job, whereas that is much better for workers in the United States than having the whole job moved to Japan or China.
Yeah, there are a couple businesses in town who have been criticized because they have contracted out some of their work overseas, wherever, but at least they're still in business.
Yes.
And they're still employing a certain number of people at
Yes.
that rate. It's going to be interesting to see how all this evolves, because one thing that I think happens that people don't understand is when those jobs do go overseas, those people's standard of living raises.
Absolutely.
They want more product. They want their television. They'll buy more televisions, and therefore their salaries have to go up to afford that. So eventually, even China, I think, is experiencing competition from countries that pay less than they do.
China has exported many of the low-cost or low-salary, low-wage jobs out of China, or more deeply into China. China, as
Right.
you know, is heavily developed along the coast. But as you go further and further west, you come into more and more subsistence and primitive living arrangements, so that businesses are going further and further inland to China, as well as going to other countries. Some of these other countries also, as you may have read about recently, they have concentrated on some of these low-level jobs to such an extent, and their export market, that as the export market for them has dried up in the United States,
They have nowhere to go.
They have nowhere to go, so
Right.
they have, they're talking hundreds of millions of people who may go back into poverty, who in the last 10 years have come out of poverty in these areas. So it's what we're going through here in the United States is difficult for us, but it doesn't compare with what many of these other countries are going through today.
And we also have the safety nets of unemployment insurance and so on to help people through this time. But I think this leads us into the policies that countries make, which can, our country included, which can cause jobs to be shipped overseas or not. And one of the big things that sure you know these policies better than I do, but when the labor unions are encouraged to unionize a certain part of the workforce or something, the states that have laws that allow that to happen more easily tend to have a higher unemployment rate because the jobs move. So policies cause these job shifts too. So you can speak to some of those outstanding policies.
Well, having gone to University of Michigan, Michigan is a basket case right at the moment. And Michigan has perhaps the strongest union base of any state in the Midwest.
With the car making
because
industry.
Of the auto manufacturing. American auto manufacturers for years approached their wage negotiations with the UAW that they could give things, especially things in the future, because their customers would have to buy from them anyway, and the price could go up and cover it. When competition came in the form of Toyota and Honda and Mercedes-Benz, and you name any number of them, Volkswagen, people had other choices. Now, in those countries, their unions also have unions, company unions, but in the case of most of those manufacturers, when the American market had been penetrated, they built factories here. And they did not build those factories in Michigan. They built them in states that were friendlier to companies. They paid their employees well. And that part of the auto business is prospering. I drove over here in my Toyota. That Toyota is 90% U.S. parts. That's more than you'll get in
a GM or
GM or Chrysler or Ford product.
Yeah, well, and the idea that they went to usually southern states had less strong unions and more welcoming of a manufacturing base. Now you say they pay their employees well. Their employees made about half, I think, roughly half what Michigan car manufacturers paid. And their benefits weren't the same. But let's talk about what half is. Half is like $40 an hour. It's a good wage even for anywhere.
It's a very good wage, and just how skewed it has been for a long time. In World War II, they built B-24 bombers at Willow Run in Michigan, really under UAW. And they built B-24 bombers in California. The B-24 bomber built in Willow Run cost 10 times the cost of building the plane in the West Coast. That is...
Union versus non-union.
I think there was a union on the West Coast, but not the same kind of union.
Uh-huh.
And that kind of differential is not sustainable.
No, and that's where the world economy is putting pressure on us more than anything, right?
Yeah, and all of us can afford more things because of this. So, if all of our TV sets had to be built in Brattleboro, I don't think many of us could afford a color TV set.
Yeah, the price would be too high.
The price would just be too high. It'd be astronomical.
Well, but in the policies of politicians, it's always interesting how they, again, it's sort of a class warfare kind of thing, although I think who they end up hurting the most are people who are either in poverty or are not much above it, because prices become then higher for things that they need to have.
It is true. We go back to energy independence, and we'll talk about that some other time. But politicians make statements which, if they were checked out, very often are extremely inaccurate. but they are feel-good, sound-good statements. We'll do this, we'll do that. I recently went to one of Bernie Sanders' town meetings, and he had 5 subjects he wanted to discuss. And the one thing I found in our discussions were that he did not talk about how any of the programs he suggested would be paid for. And
minor detail.
Minor detail. And he also talked about energy independence and the terrible Middle East. We get most of our oil and gas that we import from Canada.
And Mexico.
And then Mexico. So I find it difficult to think of our Canadian friends in turbans. It's just not that simple. And when we talk about finance, he doesn't address ever the role that the Congress and the executive branch of government have played in creating many of the problems that we're now working our way out of. So I guess I'd ask anyone when they listen to our political leaders, listen to them, take a few notes about what they say, and then go on the web and
try to verify it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, that leads us into another big part of the economy, and I think, from what I've read, been the major cause is the housing collapse, and how Congress under Jimmy Carter and I think it's a Community Reinvestment Act.
That's part of it. Was
meant to provide low-interest loans to people who would normally not qualify. And normally to qualify, you have to have at least 20% of the value of the home you want to purchase to put down.
Something to put down, anyway.
Yeah, something. But typically, I think the typical loan was 20% of the value. And you could borrow that other 20%, but the interest rate would probably knock you out of the park. So people did not do it. So, but this was to get more people in home ownership. It had an initial impact, but like anything, it will snowball if fed more. And Congress in the 1990s under Clinton fed it a lot, and it grew and grew and grew. And we all toted good housing ownership is important for communities, but when people are given 100 or 125% of the value and then can walk away because there's nothing invested, and it drives up the values beyond sustainable levels, I think I've summarized what happened.
Well, some of the driving up is just supply and demand. If there are enough people that suddenly have the ability to buy,
which Congress made possible,
and they only have so many buildings built, then you have this upward pressure. But in one of the papers last weekend, a young couple were on the front page, and they said, "We qualified." This is a young couple, in mid-20s. "We qualified for a $555,000 starter house."
Ooh, that's high.
But
where do they live? I don't know. Maybe it makes a difference.
But we decided to be conservative and only buy a $350,000 house. Mm-hmm. And I thought, some of us here in Vermont are out of touch. but really, the government put pressure on the banks and the financial institutions to lend money. They put pressure downward on interest, which meant that the banks had a squeeze on their profits. So that resulted in banks borrowing more money so they could leverage giving these loans, and they began putting together bundles of mortgages and selling them in the market as secured bonds.
Okay. So the banks could borrow money a little cheaper than we could even borrow it.
Yes.
Which made them, if they borrowed enough of it, then they could lend it out and make squeak a little profit. So you needed volume.
Especially if they were Freddie Mae or Freddie Mac.
Yeah.
Then you began having people in the chain of supply, shall we say, including the banks, but including a lot of other people, who could make money by selling a house, who did not care if the people buying it could pay for it or anything else, because they got paid for the sale. And there were managers that were in charge of sales, and there were salesmen that got paid. But when it all went bad, they were long gone. That was not
their
not
thing
my
to
department.
You're not their department to collect the money, just give it
No,
out.
That's right, and that exacerbated the problem terribly.
Now, was that kind of a system set up because of the volume of, I mean, people were going to see homes with a checkbook in hand, kind of thing. I mean, homes were turning over quickly. Just volume might have caused banks to do it like that. Or all this ads you see on television, you know, for loans, you know, Ditech, Lending Tree, so on and so forth.
Well, right now, go try to get some money there. We do know that Bernie Franks last week said he thought that they should lower the standards on qualifying people for condominiums.
Here we go again.
The same thing we've just been through.
How can he say that after that, and with a straight face? And he's the chairman of the Banking and Finance Committee.
Yeah. But to me, if you go back to economics, and we have to come back to that sad subject. When they started giving 60-month financing on cars that would run 3 years, what was that going to do to you someday down the road when those cars were done, but they hadn't been paid for yet?
You walk away. Too much supply.
They walk away, and the housing situation. I was approached. Buy a condo, nothing down. We'll flip it for you in 3 months, and you'll make 25%. That exacerbated, talk about speculating, that exacerbated the problem. But it also meant that when it collapsed, there were a lot of people
holding the bag.
And I'm sorry for the people that are losing their homes, but I'm not sorry at all for the people that speculated that way.
Okay. Well, I think that's the end of our time on this subject. And we thank you, Milt, for joining us. Tremendous amount of information. I know you are a real student of this stuff. And we thank you all for watching. You've been watching Neighbor to Neighbor. My name is Lynn Coram. I've been here with Milton Eaton. We'd also like to thank our sponsors, Media Room Productions and Stacy Subaru. And we'll see you on our next show. Have a good day.